How much mon did each person get each day? We all know that it was an exact amount, and there were no extras, and there was no shortage. The question is, how much and why? Why is that amount so important? The parasha saying, "Beim Soif Parashat Mon," in our parasha, at the end of the story where the Torah tells us about the mon, then the Torah tells us what seems like an anecdotal detail, but maybe is an important detail, that the quantity of mon that you got, which was an oimer, that amount is 1/10 of an ephah. So the Rebbe asks, that doesn't seem to make sense. Why is the Torah only telling us what an oimer is at the end of the story? Why don't you tell us up front how much mon everybody got? Nachdem, wie der Torah erzählt alle Protein wegen dem Mon, bis noch sein Ende, und soll auch es haben aboim shana aboim aleretz neshavos. This is after the Torah has told us all the other details about the mon, including the span of time that they ate the mon, which was until they came to a settled land in Eretz Yisrael, which is at least some part after 40 years. And only after that you tell us, and by the way, the portion of mon equals 1/10 of an ephah. Freer in the parasha. Logically, the Torah should have told us that earlier. The first time you tell us that the mon is an oimer, tell us then what an oimer is. So the Bechaya is Mazmin b'pnei shekol parasha mavoyres in Yonu shel mon. Rabbeinu Bechaya suggests, well, it's because the parasha is all about what the mon is about, and then at the end, after it tells us all of the story of how they engaged the mon, how they got the mon, etc., then the Torah has to clarify how much mon they got. But Achera is their spirit, but even that answer is not clear. Why is the measure of how much an oimer is somehow separate from the rest of the story? Rabbeinu Bechai is telling us, you tell us the story of the mon, and then you tell us the measure of the mon. Surely the measure of the mon is part of the story. But if the purpose of the pasuk by telling us that an oimer is 1/10 of an ephah is just so we should know what an oimer is, because oimer is already mentioned early in the pasuk, and perhaps I'm basing it there, maybe we don't know what an oimer is. Well, if that's the reason that you have to explain what an oimer is, that's all the more logic to say, tell me up front. So when I go through the story and I'm reading about an oimer, I should know what it is. Because the quantity of money is not some unrelated detail, but it's actually quite key to the story and understanding what happened with the mon. Because the mon fell in response to the Jews' complaints. As the pasuk tells us, they said to Moshe Rabbeinu, you took us out into this desert. What's going to happen over here is you're going to starve us in the desert. So what the Eibishter gesagt in response to that, the Eibishter said, I heard the complaints of the Jewish people, and therefore the Torah mamshich, and therefore the Torah continues. That the Eibishter tells Moshe Rabbeinu, this is what the Eibishter, as Moshe now telling the Jewish people what Hashem told them. This is what Hashem instructed. Each person should take the amount that they need to eat. One oimer each, relative to your numbers. And then they measured the oimer of mon that they got. Anybody who took extra landed up with no extra. And anybody who took less landed up not having less than they needed. Every person got what they needed. In that context, surely it is relevant. If the whole story is that they got enough to eat, and enough to eat is an oimer, it's valuable for us to know what is an oimer. In order to know how much food would satiate them on a daily basis. And this was so precise that any extra was unnecessary and kind of dissolved. Anybody who took extra landed up without having that extra. And if they had less than an omer, it wouldn't be sufficient, and therefore they ensured that if somebody collected wrong and they got less than an omer, it wouldn't actually be less. So clearly an omer is important information. Why not tell me what it is? That implies as the pasuk that the pasuk which says an omer equals 1/10 of an ephah It's not just so we should have the benefit of knowing what the amount, the volume of food that they got was, and how much satisfies a person, which is obviously earlier in the parasha before this measure is given. Obviously, if the Torah now, after the story of the man, is now telling me about the 10th of an ephah, this is now further information about the man that I did not necessarily have before. Okay, what is that information? This information is not something which is integral to the core story of what the man is about, even the core feature of what the man is about, as we'll see. In Midbar, and it's not relevant to how the man was distributed to them, how it fell during the 40 years in the desert. But this is information that's actually relevant at the end of the story, because the parasha by this point has already told us how long the man is going to be around for, and then it tells us the measure of the man. That implies the measure of the man is actually going to be more relevant at the end of the story of the Jews in the desert than it is during the time the man actually fell. That they ate the man until they got to a settled land, to the edge of Canaan. That's very interesting information. Something about the man, and specifically the measure of how you work out an omer, is actually more relevant at the end of the Midbar stay. Why? Before we can get there, let's address something else which also seems a little unusual. When the pasuk tells us, each person should gather what they need to eat. What is that? It's one omer each. That every person got the exact same amount, one omer. In humans are not that way. We don't all have the same capacity to eat, the same need to eat. Especially if you compare an adult to a child. And also larger and smaller people. You need a different amount to satisfy different people. So how's it possible? How could it be it's one omer for a baby and one omer for a fully grown adult or a teenager, if you've had that experience? And especially adults are not all the same body mass. So somebody who's got a larger body mass probably needs more food. How's it one omer? It's lefi ochloi, but it's one omer. How does that square off? You'll tell me because it's a miracle, like the whole man is a miracle. The whole story of the man falling and every detail within that story is given on Inyan Nisi was all supernatural. In fact, we know that the eating of the man was a supernatural experience. It would taste like various things, many things. You could kind of imagine what you were eating, and it tasted like that with certain limitations. It didn't produce any waste matter. It's a miraculous food. It shouldn't surprise us. That it's a miraculous food, so whatever amount you eat, it satisfies you no matter who you are, no matter your body mass. The thing with that argument is, you don't find any clear indication of this point. The Chazal tell us all the various miracles associated with man. This is not one of them. They don't say that the miracle is that one measure of man satiated all people. Even though the Gemara speaks about various other special elements of the man. And the Gemara even describes things that are said clearly in the pasuk and still tells us, look how miraculous it is. For example, the fact that those who collected more landed up with an omer and those who collected less landed up with an omer, that's a miracle identified in the pasuk, expressed by Rashi. So Chazal pick out the miracles. This is not one of them. You won't find a source that says the miracle is one omer satisfies all people. Muslim sagen. So therefore you have to conclude. As das was an omer is given genug Seifra kon beyoser. Seifra gadol beyoser. The fact that an omer of man satisfies every type of person regardless of size and age, is nikin nes noisef in the man. That's not a miracle over and above the man. So there's man, and then it also has miraculous taste. Man, and it miraculously expands or contracts according to your needs. But rather, das ist verbunden mit dem Geder von Mon, mitzat teva hamon. This oimer property, one-size-fits-all aspect of Mon, is not a miracle of the Mon, that is the essence of the Mon. And that's what we have to get to. The essence of the Mon is expressed in the single quantity across the board of all people. What does that mean? So to get to that, we're going to step out of the world of the Mon, kind of, because the Gemara we're referring to actually speaks in the context of the Mon. And we're going to talk about food, generally, the halachic concept of how much food does a person need in order to live. The section in the Gemara Yuma that describes the Mon, interestingly, is in the middle of a section that discusses the affliction, self-affliction that you have to have on Yom Kippur, which includes fasting. So in that conversation, if you're talking about fasting and afflicting yourself on Yom Kippur, naturally part of the conversation is how much does a person have to eat to transgress the restriction of Inoy on Yom Kippur. So we find something, we find something about the halachas of eating on Yom Kippur, which is similar to this concept that one amount of mon is appropriate for everybody. So the shir achir v'achir b'Yom Kippurim is kakoiseves. The amount of food that a person has to eat on Yom Kippur in order to be liable for punishment is a koiseves, which is basically almost like a what do you call it? Figs that have been, what do you call them? Dates that have been compressed together. On the Gemara sagt den Tam, Kimel Rabbana. So the Gemara says the reason why you could have one measure for all people. Says the Gemara, fascinating. The Bahachi B'Keiseves meyasvedaita. That's enough to satisfy a person. Less than that amount will not satisfy a person. But the only thing is that an average person, that amount makes you feel very satisfied. And if you were the size of Oig Melech HaBashan, it would satisfy you a little bit. Interesting. So there's a one-size-fits-all satiating of people with food. That's surprising. How do you explain this answer that the Gemara is giving? That you could have one measure of food for which a person is considered to have eaten on Yom Kippur. You can ask again. If a koiseves is enough to satisfy the giant oig, so surely surely then for ordinary people our size, it should take much less than a koseves to satisfy us. And if for the rest of us a koseves is enough to satisfy us, we can assign as the zelba shus or poils and the miyasvedaita for the Igmelech HaBashan. How could that same measure be enough for Igmelech HaBashan? Is mizegu for muchach that proves as the shir koseves was miyasvedaita, that concept that a koseves is enough to satisfy a person is a shir v'cha mesech nit mit godel hakuf. That is a measurement that is unrelated to your body mass, to your body size. Strange idea, right? So there must be something else about food and how food, so to speak, satisfies us that we're missing in this conversation. Parenthetically, the Rebbe says this speaks to the great conversation/debate about when the Torah gives certain measurements. Is that as the Agdora from the Shir Ken Zayin of Tzvei Fanim, the two possible ways that those parameters of that shir could work. Asher mitztaref, either a shir is a whole lot of increments, so you have a little bit, until eventually you have a kazayas. Oder asher atzmi, or if it is a standalone essence concept. A kazayas is a kazayas. Anything before kazayas is irrelevant. Now, he's mentioning it here as a kind of a sidebar, but it's going to become a big part of our conversation. The Dargachova is marich b'chama dinim. The Dargachova identifies this in many halachas. From the Plukta Klolis zwischen Rabbi Yochanan and Beshalach. And the first place that conversation begins is the great debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Beshalach about by chatzi shir. If a person has less than the full amount that is identified by the Torah for which a person is liable. Is less than that amount actually forbidden as far as the Torah is concerned, or not? So why is there a debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish whether chatzi shir is osir or not? In other words, if I have less than a kazayis of something that's not kosher, have I transgressed? I'm not liable yet because I haven't yet had a kazayis. Liability comes when the shir hits. But is it forbidden before the liability comes? So what's the basis of that debate? It's going to be relevant to our conversation. Rabbi Yochanan says the smallest amount of treif is forbidden. So that implies that when the Torah said you can't have a kazayas of something, it means anything that gets you to that kazayas builds that shiur, so any amount of that forbidden food is forbidden. In other words, forbidden for you to have. The food is forbidden, now it's forbidden for you to have. Was steht von Chalokim, welche werden jetzt zusammen bis zu a ganzen shiur. A kazayas is made up of all these little pieces that constitute a kazayas, and therefore any one of those pieces is forbidden to have. So therefore, even if it's not yet a kazayas, the concept of prohibition, the concept that it's forbidden, applies to that little piece. You cannot have it. But you are not liable for punishment until you've accumulated all of the pieces of the puzzle to get the total shiur. Then you could be punished. But each piece of that shiur, says Rabbi Yochanan, is asur. Aber Reish Lakish halt as the shiur is asher atzmi. Reish Lakish says no. Kazayas is a concept that exists in and of itself. It's not built to a kazayas. At the point of kazayas, it becomes a concept. Prior to the point of kazayas, it doesn't exist. In other words, so therefore, if I eat less than a kazayas of something I shouldn't eat, it's lav krumel. It's like nothing happened because we haven't yet got to the concept of a kazayas. The concept that this item is forbidden only begins from kazayas and up. Okay, so the Azbora Bozeh. Let's latch that back into the concept of the man, which obviously is not about forbidden foods or about fasting. Rather, the man was there to ensure that we don't starve, because that was the complaint that the Jewish people had, in order to keep us alive. So the Azbora Bozeh in dem Chayes and Nefesh B'Guf seinen da Bichlolus zwei Sachen. If you have to talk about being alive, which is the neshama giving vitality to the body, there are really two phases, two elements to this. Aleph, der Chayes Kloli was is Mechai den ganzen Guf b'shaveh. Firstly, you have a generic energy that the neshama puts into the body and makes the whole body, top to toe, live. In dem Chai ist ein Token Chiluk zwischen dem Ofen, wie es Mechai dem Roish, und wie es Mechai andere Chelke HaGuf. From that perspective, the neshama is not going to discriminate between the top, the bottom, the brain, the most vital organs, the most complex organs, the simplest organs. It's irrelevant. This is life. Life is either yay or nay. Either you're alive or chas v'sholem. And therefore, the kind of life provided by the neshama to every part of the body is the same. Das heißt, das, was der Mensch lebt, ist gleich in dem ganzen Guf. In other words, the person's alive, that means the whole body is alive. The fingers are alive in the same way as the brain is alive. It's either yes or no. It's either on or off. So in the same way as in one human body, live or not, there's no distinction whether it's live at the brain or live at the ankle or the heel. It's all the same. Because that particular input of life is not defined by or limited to the specific organ it's giving life to. In the same way, there's no difference between one person and the next. It's the same concept. Either the person is alive or they're not alive. Either the neshama is in the body keeping it going or it's not. Doesn't matter who the person is. Doesn't matter how big they are, how mature they are, how spiritual they are. It's irrelevant. By jedem is the nefesh v'chayis hakloli der nefesh in demselben oifen. Every single human being experiences this dimension of life equally. Theoretically, if you could remove the nefesh from a child and put it into Oig Melech HaBashan, he would live in the same way as the child lives. This is an on-off switch. It's either you're alive or you're not alive. It's chayas or chas v'shalom no chayas. Then after that, you can proceed to the next stage, which is beis chayas haprati. The specific, the bespoke aspects of life, how they relate to the unique parts of the human being. That's going to be different in every person and different in every component of every person. And each part of the body, each organ of the body needs the delivery of the correct chayus so it can achieve what it has to achieve. In Roish, was is Amer Eidele Chelek is a chayus proti in Emer Meir v'nante chalakim. The brain, which obviously is the most advanced and most refined part of the body, needs to have a much more accessible, clear energy than, for example, a person's kidneys, even though the kidneys perform a vital role in the body. And the same applies to every single limb and organ in the body. It gets the right chayas that it needs to do its job. And of course, when you're at that detailed layer of chayos, every person is different. Every person has different chayos because every individual is designed differently. Now that we know how chayos works, let's talk about what sustains chayos, which is food. Person has nutrition, then the neshama can activate the body, and the person lives. So because chayos, because the life force of the body could manifest in these two different ways, generic or specific. So food, which links soul to body, which links vitality to form, also has to operate in two ways. There is a key generic amount of food that is necessary for a neshama to remain in keeping a body alive. That's enough to ensure that the neshama can keep that body living. Now, as we've already illustrated, the idea that the body lives is not a matter of a whole lot of details. It's an on-off switch. It's a binary reality. Either you're alive or chas v'sholem. Is moving as the achile was tut of dem chiber. So then the kind of eating which allows that generic chayos, b'shneitit von sirf pratim, nosis ashir atzmi. The amount of food required for that is not going to be designed by a whole lot of details that come together in order that you have the eating plan that you need. No, this will be a core baseline of how much nutrition everybody needs, and that's across the board. And so how much food that takes is not contingent on who you are and what your physical makeup is. Dos is the shir kakeseves. That's the shir of a keseves, which the Gemara identifies. That the Gemara identifies is enough to satiate. In other words, to remove the affliction, to remove the as they called it in the story, ra'av, the famine, the hunger of every person. Everybody, even oik. Das ashir atzmi. That is an immutable, absolute shir. Everybody can survive on this shir. In the same way as the generic energy of soul in the body to keep alive is equal in all people, so there's an absolute measure of minimum nutrition that every person needs in order to survive. Then base, there's the shir achila velchis verbund mit chais proti, was is aufgemassen lefi klär guf shalo lefi protov. Then there's your personal eating plan, what you need for your metabolism and your stage in life and your weight category, etc. Boyfin, as was größer de guf is, as größer de shir mozen was nötig für ein chais proti. In that context, different sizes of bodies, bigger bodies, are going to need more nutrition. They're going to burn more calories. They're going to need put in more calories. That measure of food is a mitzvah shir. You've got to put together all the pieces of the puzzle to come to the conclusion of how much nutrition you need and what kind of nutrition you need. Because this particular kind of energy is dependent on the different parts of the body and what they need. Aber Meile is moving as the shir achile was is scheich zu dem chayes is zunufgestellt from pratim. So because this is nutrition to service the different facets of the body, the nutrition itself requires different facets. Yeah, the prat von dem shir is moisif in dem chayes and it's metzach by jeden einen lefi gedel aguf chedek shaboy vesen zum chayes anefesh shaboy u proteha. So each part of the diet is going to relate to a specific part of the person and the way that we link the relevant neshama energy to that part of the body. Okay, now that we understand the principle, that principally there's this concept of core nutrition and then tailor-made nutrition to service either keeping alive or facilitating all the various functions of the body, let's go back to the mon. The fact that the Torah uses two different expressions to effectively give us two different measures about the mon. Firstly, there is Omer, which occupies most of the story. And then at the end of the story, on Asiri Sa'efa, what an Omer equals, that it's a tenth of an Ephah, is as follows. The Lashon Asiri Sa'efa is Madgish Ashir, which is a Chelek from a Grestrin Shir. Mizeh. Ephah. When I speak about a tenth of an ephah, I'm referencing the omer in context of what it's building towards. Take 10 of these omers and you'll get an ephah. Rashi is meforish as ephah sholosh sin chulein it's asir sefer mem gimel beitza mechemish beitza. Rashi goes into the whole calculation. 1 ephah is 3 sa'ah, and therefore a tenth of an ephah, which is an omer, is 43 and a fifth volumes of eggs. Goes into all of that. So in other words, Asir Sa'efa is telling you how to calculate the details of this nutrition. Whereas whereas Omer is an expression that's not getting into the actual detail of how you determine this shear, welche is from protim and gimel beitza v'chemesh beitza, how you do the whole calculation to work out what this is in your kitchen. No, ein midah. It's just a measure. An absolute. Und das ist der Tam, was in der Parsha Samon Kulo sagt die Torah bloß einmal gegeles, weil moide baim v'chayotze bose. This is the reason why throughout the whole story of the Mon, we keep saying Omer without defining it. Und erst besiam lachrea Parsha is supposed to refer them shira va'imar asir saifahu. After we finish the story of the Mon, then we start to dissect what is an Omer. It's a tenth of an ephah. In the Parsha Retzach Bike wegen Ashir Omer from Mon. Because the bulk of the parasha speaking about the mon is speaking about the absolute measure, not the combined measure. And therefore it is this measure that is not split up into different pieces because it's not about the specifics of the person's function, it's rather about the basics of keeping the person alive. Because the purpose of the mon is, they said, we're going to starve. Mon is to ensure that doesn't happen, to make sure that you stay alive. To keep the generic energy of the neshama inside the body. Similar to how the Gemara defined that a koseves is the minimum that a person needs in order to eat, and therefore eating it on Yom Kippur is a problem. The surprising aspect of the mon was that even though the mon obviously didn't just keep them alive, it actually gave them enough sustenance that they could be functioning human beings, each with all of the energy and nutrition that they needed. Unlike ordinary food, where you really have to have an appropriate nutrition plan that is for you and your metabolism, here that was achieved by a generic absolute shear, exactly the same food in exactly the same measure for every single person. But at the end of the parasha, we stick in the information that an omer equals 1/10 of an ephah. Why? Because we want to add another insight. As the monot in sich gehat von Shem mitzaref, that you should know that there's something about the mon that also has that specific bespoke element to it. But that information is not critical to understanding the effect and wasn't critical to the experience of eating mon for 40 years in the desert. But only when they end the 40 years in the desert and they're now entering Eretz Yisrael, this aspect of the mon becomes relevant. We'll get to explain what that is. Now, before we can get there, let's remember, mon is not ordinary food. It is very much food for the soul. As the mon is we know that mon was not just to sustain the body, not just to satisfy human hunger and ensure the neshama could remain within the body, but it was spiritual. The truth is, if the objective was to feed the Jews physical food, the Eibishter could have made the desert bloom. It would have been a miracle, and they would have eaten regular food. But he wants them to eat supernatural food for a reason. The man is, as described in Tilim, it is the food of heroes, so to speak. It's the food of malachim. It doesn't belong in our world. Das heißt, as der man is verdienen gewinnt, nicht nur am Mosen von Gashmis den Guf, nur euch am Mosen ruchni faden neshama. So it's clear we have to know that the man is not just there to sustain the human body, but it's to feed the soul, and that's why lo nitna Torah ela lo ich le'aman. The only people who could accept the Torah had to be exposed to the man. The goal of the man is to link the body and the neshama specifically to the source of the neshama, so that the neshama could be bound with the Eibishter. That's the purpose of man. In the same way as we've described that nutrition has two ways that it keeps the neshama plugged into the body, the generic and the specific. And therefore, the nutritional value of food operates in two ways: the generic to keep you alive, and the specific to function as you. The same kind of process must apply to giving energy to the neshama from its source. And we're talking obviously over here about the divine soul. There is the absolute core of the neshama, which is the source of real life. What that means is the pintel yid that every single one of us has, it's an absolute measure of connection to Hashem that never wavers, doesn't grow, doesn't diminish, regardless. It's absolute. And then there's, of course, the way that then spreads out and expresses itself into the various details. And what does it mean into the various details? Then you have all of the details of how the neshama, the nefesh hakis, is going to influence all the capacity I have, my intellect, my emotions, etc. In the same way as the nutrition plan for the various components of the body, this is your soul's nutrition plan. And that would explain why the man is typically an oimer, which is an absolute measure. And it is experienced equally in all people. As the Parashas Hamon emphasizes, because it keeps referring to the oimer as the reference point for the man. Why is that? Let's understand where the Jews are in their spiritual journey. The Navi Yecheskel tells us that Yetzias Mitzrayim was the birth of the Jewish nation. For 40 years in the desert, mostly the Jewish people are considered still like a baby, or at the very least, an adult who's completely reliant on his father for support. A baby, all of the baby's needs are provided by the mother or the father. That's how the Yidden were in the midbar. They were not self-sufficient. As the Eibishter hat sich gegeben, sehr alle Bedürfnisse. The Eibishter provided everything we needed: Mozain, food, mayim, water, levoshim, chole, clothing, etc. Kasher, as the pasuk tells us, kasher yisah ha'oimen esayonek, like a nursing mother with her baby. Und also wie bei Atinik ist erste Jahr noch seine Lodas in the same way as a baby in his first years is by him nicht you don't really see the specific talents or values or assets of the child. Von Seichel Sheberosh, his intellect, or Midah Shebelev, or his deep emotional context. You don't see that in a baby. No, by him is speaking kloli. Typically, in a baby, what you see is just the generic version of life, almost a primitive version of life. Which applies to the entire body equally. So was is in Megadol is the zelba, and the food that the baby eats in the initial stage is the same food every single day. Und in dem fertigen Meichel hat alle nicht Chelek Mosen und alle Teimen. He gets, that's it, he's nursed from his mother, that's what he eats. It contains all of the nutrition that he needs. And there's even a suggestion that it has all the flavors possible. That was the experience of the Jewish people for the 40 years in the desert, straight after the birth of our nation. The spiritual nutrition that they received, which came via the physical nutrition called man, it was an absolute, like a generic, a base kind of inspiration or spiritual nutrition. The oimer. In other words, they were experiencing the chayes that comes from the depth, the core, the essence of the neshama. The absolute link and bond between us and Hashem. That is that's not something that's beyond the experience of difference. Those who are more advanced, those who are less advanced. This is beyond all of that. This is absolutely shared. And through that same diet, that same food that they were given for 40 years in the desert, is mostly by kamataimen. It gave them access to all these various flavors. In other words, the connection was obviously a more mature connection than just simply, deep down having a relationship with Hashem, but it all comes from the Etzem HaNeshama. With that information, we can unpack other details of the man that are relevant. We see that when they measured how much man they got, the people who grabbed a whole lot still had just an oimer, and the people who took too little also had an oimer. As by the mamit od nit gefällt von dem oimer lagol goyles, the person who gathered too little didn't lack the oimer. On by the marbe lilkoit, and the person who overdid it is thinking of a mervi oimer lagol goyles did not land up with extra over the oimer. Was cheres nicht verstandig? That's very weird. The sibba for was eine is given a marbe und der zweite a mamit. Why do you think one person was grabbing more mon and the next person less? Remember, this is not regular physical food. It must be that the person wants more mon, values lechem min hashamayim, he values spiritual connection. Und der Mamet hat nicht gefühlt kol kach dem yoker hamon. Whereas the person who's taking less is a little bit more lackadaisical about it, doesn't appreciate to the same extent the value of mon. And wer steht in Mechilta, like the Mechilta tells us, so the Medrash says, you know what's going to happen. Nachshon ben Aminadav is going to grab as much money as possible, and a poor man is going to take little. What's the Medrash telling us? I said, moving as dos was Nachshon ben Aminadav melaket harbe. You talk about Nachshon ben Aminadav, one of the most respected people in that period of history. The fact that he's taking a lot of mon, is not given to the mon als mosen gashmi. It's not because he wanted a lot of food in his house. He had a raging appetite. Not the far was osam mosen de malach ashoris, because he appreciated the fact that this is the food of malachim, and he wants access to that food. And on the other hand, the fact that the only should be so maintenance beikar only beruchnius and only elebedas. When we're talking about a poor person over here, we're not talking about their bank balance. Every year who came out of Mitzrayim was extremely wealthy. 15 donkeys laden with treasure. Ein ani elebedas. True poverty is in a person's perception, a person's reality that they're living in their head. Was bei ihm is nicht given the mon als lechem min hashamayim. He didn't really appreciate the value of the fact that this mon is lechem min hashamayim. To him, it looks like bland food. And if he wasn't that enthusiastic to gather as much as possible, he's a bit schlepped his feet a little bit. And despite that radical difference, when they came to measure, everybody's got the same amount of mon. Not only that, even those Yidden who rebelled against Moshe. And they kept some of the mon till the next day, even though they were told it's not going to sustain. They did not follow the instructions that were specific to the mon. To the extent that some of them went out looking for mon on Shabbos, which is a direct contravention of what Moshe said. We do not see any record that they landed up with zero mon. Of course, when they went looking on Shabbos, there was no mon to retrieve. But the people who kept it till the next day, we don't see that their oimer disappeared. They still had an oimer. That's incredibly strange. Wenn der Nest wollte given by von as Eibishter hat sie gegeben lechem in Oretz lechem TV, had Eibishter given them the nace of regular bread, somehow growing in the desert. Warum ich kann sagen, also Jois im Sadel Bush Ateva. Setzt sich nicht begolik in Chilek zwischen ein Eden und a zweiten. You'd say, listen, you're talking about regular physical bread. When you're observing physical bread and therefore you're looking at physical people, you can't really tell the difference between one and the next. Der Fabal kommt der Marbo und Mamit b'midah Shaveh. Then, okay, you get it. At the end of the day, everybody will receive the same amount, no matter how much they collected. But da redt sich aber wegen Lechem min hashamayim, was seinen ruchni v'nisi. But we're talking about bread from heaven. We're talking about a spiritual bread that is presented daily in a supernatural way. Aber bald as beruchni seinen Nicke de Chilukim v'dargus von Eden, spiritually different Jews are very different to each other. Aber gedarf sein Chilukim midas Hamon. Surely, a spiritual delivery system should be shared differently with people who are more inclined to spirituality than those who are less. As bei jedem Eden, sollte mit Samon sein Behessen sein Meile Beruchnis. You'd expect that there's a grading system where you get mon that is suited to your spiritual growth and development. Ulafoyel is God gefallen by Fanafach. And the exact opposite happened. Anes Godel. You see a miracle that undoes that. As by Marbe by Nachshon is given Veiniker, that somebody like Nachshon ben Aminadav who treasures the value of mon and wants to get as much as possible, we take it away from him. Und bei Mamit on Ibadas is Gevarim Mer. And the person who couldn't really appreciate what money is about, we give him more. To ensure that there's a balance, that they all get a perfect oimer. It doesn't seem to make sense. Until you realize Al Pi Anal is move on what we explained before. Is given in the Moifim for Shir Atzmi. Because 40 years in the desert, the way that the Jewish people eat is from an absolute quantity. And the reason it is an absolute quantity for all people is because it represents the Pintel Yid, which is absolute and equal in all people. Und der Nekudas Hayadus ist ständig ganz bei jedem Eden. The Pintel Yid is always whole in every single person. Bis der Alter Rebbe sagt, dass B'shas Achet, oisa bam neite Yisbarach, to the extent that the Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya, that even at the time that the person is actively rebelling against Hashem by doing an Aveira, the Nekudas Hayadus is absolute. It doesn't waver. So naturally, the heavenly food associated with this concept can never be delivered or experienced differently from one Jew to the next. Es kommt on zu jeden Eden b'shaveh. Every Yid receives an oimer, the same amount of mon, because that represents what the mon is about. That represents what being Jewish is about. So now we can appreciate why the moment where the Torah tells us the technical composition of an oimer, that it's a tenth of an ephah, that goes at the end of the parasha, when they're pretty much at the end of the story, where they've already described that it's going to be for 40 years, which means technically we're after the 40 years. After the Torah has told us that they're going to eat man until they get to Eretz Yisrael. In the same way as we've now identified both in regular nutrition and spiritual nutrition, there are two potential measures. The composite measure, put the increments together till you get a total, and the absolute measure, which never changes. Shir atzmi, absolute, and shir mitztarev, incremental. And we've matched those to the two ways in which the chayas of the nefesh affects the body. Alive, chayas atzmi, and the specific chayas for each function in the body, chayas mitztarev. Der says, the Muslim from Klal Yisrael Saldasim Bisabus and Lam Yisrael, likewise in Mon, which is the core food of the Jewish people in their developmental stage as a Jewish nation, had to have both components, an absolute value, stam, and an incremental or composite value, the tenth of an ephah. But the Chelek is, the thing that distinguishes them is Zayin dik ba'midbar in Zman von Eitas Amisol Canal. For the 40 years in the desert, which is the infant phase of the Jewish people is their Mosen give a bika for them shir atzmi shibamon kenal. They survive primarily on the absolute value of the mon, the absolute connection to Hashem, like the baby that's completely reliant on the parent and hasn't yet illustrated who they are, what their character and talents and abilities are. But when they enter Israel, a settled land, now they are no longer serving the Eibishter in the desert context. Now they're getting into Eretz Yisrael. And in Eretz Yisrael, what has to happen is, you have to start expressing who you are, what you bring to the table. This territory is for that Shevet, that territory is for this Shevet. You're going to go into agriculture, you're going to go into business, you're going to go into infrastructure. Then it's the mon v'asayim mistafkim imon shebichlem at shishas ben Nisan. So then they still had mon with them that sustained them until the 16th of Nisan. Or according to a much more extreme opinion in the Mechilta that says that they actually ate man for the 14 years that it took to conquer Eretz Yisrael. 7 years of conquest and 7 years of dividing the land between the Shvatim. Whatever mon they ate at that point in time is given bika ashir mitztorif. That was mon now in its second phase, the composite mon, the complex mon, the mon where you start to identify what it's all about, what it's made of, how it relates to other things. The mon at that point is no longer the mon that feeds the core of your neshama, that keeps your basic faith alive. Now be'ikar, it's primarily at this point it's now the food of you as an individual, your bespoke contribution to Judaism, which you will start to fulfill in Eretz Yisrael. This is verbunden mit der Knesset La'aretz v'Yashvus in Eretz Yisrael, and that is directly related to entering Eretz Yisrael and becoming part of the settling of the land of Eretz Yisrael. Now, why do we need to know that today? That teaches us the following. Torah is called bread. Und die zwei Beginnes lechem, Torah lechem in Hashamayim or lechem in Haaretz. Torah also has bread from the ground and bread that comes from the heavens. Bread from the ground, Chazal tell us, refers to the revealed parts of Torah, and bread from the heavens, mon, represents the esoteric parts of the Torah. So a person will think, I'm engaged right now with a Jewish person who's just been spiritually born. He's infantile in his spirituality. He's just coming close to Yiddishkeit. So I'll give him the basics. I'll give him the staple bread from the earth. Nigle the Torah, the Chumash, Halacha, Gemara, etc. And if I am going to give him a little taste of man, the spiritual within Judaism, he's not yet ready to get the full quantum of lechem in Hashamayim. I'll just give him a taste, a little bit of inspiration. And of course, let's not even get into the conversation about somebody who hasn't even begun that journey of connection. Noch mehr. Especially if it's a person who is likely to scoff at or misuse the bread from heaven that I'm going to give him. It's really inappropriate right now for me to have to expose Primus HaTorah to such a person. And certainly not the full menu of Primus HaTorah. Therefore, the Torah teaches us in this parasha about the mon. As dos darf gegeben werden, then everybody gets mon. Without consideration for where he's holding in his spirituality. Even if this is somebody who's currently rebelling against the Eibishter. You could even argue that other parts of the Torah, which relate to the specific or revealed aspects of the neshama, then you've got to do a whole analysis and an audit of the person. Is he ready for this? Can his mind handle what we're about to teach? Can he appreciate? Can he connect? Can he resonate? But when you're talking about the bread from heaven, the deeper parts of Torah, that is a direct link to the core of the Yid, to the Pintel Yid, the essence of who he is, the absolute truth. Das heißt, die Yesodus HaTorah, that means the foundations of Torah. Emunas Hashem v'achdusai, belief in the Eibishter, appreciation for the Eibishter's oneness. And the andere, Ikore Adas v'aderech, wie der Rambam rechnet is the Gimel Ikrim, as well as the other fundamentals of Judaism, like the Rambam lists the 13 Ikrim, which include Moshiach. Paskind op Torah, as jeder eine shaykh lozeh, und shaykh zu dem shir atzmi. That the Torah wants us to know, every Yid is able to handle, has the rights and the relevance and access to this part of Torah, and at an absolute measure, not a tailor-made measure for you, not ready for it yet. The person who is the spiritually smallest has the rights and access to the same as the spiritually greatest. Because that is linked to the essence of what a Jew is, which is reflected in the essence of the name Yisrael, which represents and encapsulates all the Jewish people, as the Rambam tells us. The Rambam in Pirush HaMishnah says, when a Jew buys into and believes these 13 fundamental principles, and that clarifies his faith in these things, then that is to be truly Jewish. Was der Bild von der Emunah in der alle Yesodus Kideboy wird durch den Limit von Pnimius HaTorah, das ist Nizgala geworden bei Avona v'Hasaga. The only way to truly access, appreciate, and clarify these principles is through Pnimius HaTorah, specifically Pnimius HaTorah as presented through Chabad Hasidus, which is accessible through the rational process. Und jeder eine kann das mekabel sein. Every person can handle this. And therefore every one of us who has access to Chassidus has a responsibility to share it with every Yid. The Shvat, the Yom HaIlul von der Rebbe Nesidereno, Faltois Bekamashana Bibashana Zoy in the Woch from Parshas Beshalach. The Friedrich Rebbe's Yortzeit Yud Shvat coincides frequently with Parshas Beshalach. Was der Funes verstandig, which implies as Meiser v'Seiros v'Avidos Shabbat Eilula haben Hashaychus and seine Merumas beParshas saying that the Alter Rebbe tells us that on the Yortzeit of a tzaddik, all of his actions and all of his avoida and all of his Torah comes to fruition and is exposed and is accessible. So therefore, the Friedrich Rebbe's Torah and avoida must relate to this principle in our parasha. Zet men asoski vem from the Ikri avoidas from the Bala Eilula. So you see, this principle of sharing the man with everybody was a core principle of the Friedrich Rebbe's avoida. Aleph Yofutzu, to spread in the most radical way. Beis Maino Secha, the absolute core of Chassidus, the well springs themselves. Gimel Chutza, to the most inaccessible places. You would think, well, if I'm dealing with a Jew who's so far on the periphery, you'd think, it's good enough to give him bottled that source. Give him water that came from the river, that came from the original spring. Es nicht nötig zu bringen den Main allein. I don't have to bring the spring to him. I mean, he's so far on the periphery, he should be satisfied and excited about whatever he gets. To that we have a clear instruction. As the Mayonos Atzmum darf man bringen in Chutza. You got to take the core of the wellspring, the core of Chassidus, and bring it to the most peripheral places. Und noch mehr. It's nicht genug zu geben him not tipping von dem Main. It's not enough just to give a few drops of that precious spring water. No, it's got to be afotza. Ashir shalom. It's got to be afotza. Afotza means you give the max, the full amount, the absolute quantity. Okay, now as we've learned through the Sikha. When you share with somebody the absolute quantity of lechem min hashamayim that is equally viable for every kind of Jew from the top, in a way that the person feels the beautiful taste, that it's like honeycomb. That the person appreciates that you can have not just ordinary pleasure, but the most advanced pleasure from learning this. And by us emulating the Friedrich Rebbe's approach, which is this approach, that you take everything at its absolute max and you share it with every Yid in such a way that they appreciate it, then is that hastens the promise of Mashiach, Beicholo Shel Mashiach, that he announced in his own personal chamber in Shamayim, that by us spreading broadly the teachings of Chassidus to the most extreme places, then Mashiach will come to Malka Mashiach, Bimheira, V'yomeinu, Mamash, Mashiach will come immediately.